Greetings, everyone. My name is Kathy Mira from Erwin. I am pleased to introduce our session today, Documenting and Managing Organizational Risk. Our speaker is our very own Marios Forsos from Erwin. Marios, thank you so much for joining us at Erwin Insights.
And thank you very much for having me, Kathy.
I'll now turn the session immediately over to you to begin. Go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And literally thank you to everyone who's attending the session today. We'll try and make this, of course, in this era of social distancing, we'll try and make it as interesting for you as we humanly can. We do invite you as many questions as you want. And of course, if any of you is interested to seeing in practice what we're going to present here today, by all means, reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to walk you practically through all the things that we're going to be covering today. So without further ado, let me just start this presentation by just throwing off a couple of definitions, not because all of us are unaware of what governance, risk, and control is, but because sometimes it serves us to sort of center our focus and look at the components of what we talk about when we talk about governance, when we talk about operational risk, when we talk about compliance. Traditionally, therefore, within the operational environment of any organization, these are all covered under the umbrella governance, risk, and controls. Or most of you will probably have heard it as GRC. And essentially, it's all about talking about how do we govern our risks and controls and how we ensure the compliance through the management of risk and controls based on whatever regulatory or other legal mandates we may have. So for example, when we talk about governance, risk, and compliance, we're talking about, of course, risks and their mitigating controls. The reason I use the word mitigating here is because sometimes we tend to forget that controls are not there because we like them to be there. They're there for one and only reason, to mitigate the risks. Now, risks may arise from different things. They may be legal, they may be compliance, they may be operational, they may be technical. But what we need is for each risk to have its own set of one or multiple mitigating controls. Now, compliance, of course, sometimes comes to, as I just mentioned, things that come from the government. So regulations, you probably have heard things like GDPR. Sure, there are Basels, Sarbanes-Oxley, many different ones. And I'm sure there's going to be even more coming on in the next couple of years. Okay, but of course, it could be also cover things that we ourselves initiate. So, for example, compliance based on some of the ISO standards. And I'm sure if you talk to a lot of your IT colleagues, they will talk about ISO 27000 compliance. If you are coming to us from some of the health, the health industry, pharmaceuticals, and so on and so forth, you've got 14001 compliance and so on and so forth. These are, of course, optional, but they themselves carry with them the risks and, of course, their mitigating controls and so on and so forth. Now, we have to view all of them not as an isolated thing, and that will be, by the way, one of the axes of what we're going to be talking about, that governance, risk, and compliance this day is not something isolated. Traditionally, it used to be isolated. Usually they occupy desks and offices in an area of the building. They never talk to anyone else until the time comes for their annual review. But this actually changes day by day. And one of the central themes of today's presentation is how this has changed and how organizations come to us, come to companies such as Erwin to say, we need your help to actually make that happen. So managing your compliance, your operational risk, your governance and your risks vis-a-vis your enterprise and business architecture means managing them against your processes, against your organizations. And when I say organizations, let's not jump the gun and say, oh, you want to manage a department or a business. No, processes and systems and all of those things belong to parts of our organization. So that's what I mean when I use the word organizations, our capabilities and the services that deliver them, and of course, the infrastructure, applications, hardware, software, and all that stuff, which make all the above possible. So what we need to start thinking, and that will be true for the remaining of our presentation, is how governance, risk, and compliance, operational risk affects pretty much all of those things and how those things tie together. Unfortunately, what we have seen, and that has always been the case since time immemorial, so to speak, is that organizations sometimes fail to understand that. Even to this day, when we walk sometimes, when we talk to an organization and we introduce this concept that we're going to see here today, they sort of realize that this is not something that they have considered. Luckily for us, and again, we're going to cover that as we move on through the presentation, more and more companies these days come to us, certainly in the last 16 to 20 months, they're coming to us, and one of the first things that they reach out to us is that I want to be able to manage, I want to be able to document accurately and manage my operational risk. So what are the biggest challenges organizations face these days? So first of all, believe it or not, and I know it's going to sound, maybe doesn't apply to all of you, but certainly it's going to touch the sensitive strings for most of you, is that a lot of organizations manage this through either homemade tools or documents, checklists, Excel files, custom-made databases, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to hide from you the amount of times that I've actually seen this on customers, on even large organizations that we're working with, is personally, it stresses me out immensely, but of course it also makes me wonder as to how this world operates. So that's number one, and one of the most difficult things to address most of these days. Why? Because moving away from all these things, usually there is a cost around it. However, when organizations do have governance, risk, and control management systems, and those things tend to be very, very expensive. If any of you are coming from that particular area of the organization, you know how expensive these things are. But at the same time, they tend to be unidimensional. What do I mean by that? I mean they're actually focused, and they're working only on the principle, I need to manage my risks and my controls, or I need to manage how these are rated, how are these assessed, and so on and so forth. They tend to look at them, in other words, in an isolated bubble, without looking at how do these get implemented, how do these get controlled, and so on and so forth. The other big challenge is that because of how these systems operate, and because of all the tradition that comes out behind them, is there's very little, if any at all, connectivity between governance, risk, and control and any other layer. And I'm talking about any other layer. Even sometimes we've seen organizations where IT risks are not connected in any shape or form with enterprise architecture. Data risks are not connected with the data architects and the data scientists within the organization. They know there is a data risk, but they don't know how that is connected. And they, of course, they don't have that bidirectional view. And now, as you can see, we're building on all these sort of calamities, waterfall that we have here, when a connection is attempted. So when somebody says, I actually would like to see how my risks connect to this, or how I would like to see how my processes connect to that, that tends to be arbitrary. So it's not something that's done systemically. It's usually driven either by a random control or by new legislation or regulation that came up, and all of a sudden there is a new demand. These things tend to be arbitrary. So I want to do it now, let's do it next week, and so on and so forth. And as a result, they tend to be manual. Why? If you look at the above 3 bullet points, you will see exactly why. I have different systems, disparate systems, no connectivity, and as a result, I need to do that manually. Now, this, believe it or not, is how most of our organizations have been working in the last, 50 years, 60 years minimum, okay? However, happily, I can report to you, and we will see that in a few minutes, that this is actually changing, and it's changing for the better. And of course, not last but not least, because of all the above, it's really, really hard for an organization to do up-to-date, automatic, really dynamic impact analysis. Everything is looking at how the situation was 6 months ago, how the situation was 3 months ago. And if you are to ask one of those organizations, what happens if I do this? Chances are it's going to be exceedingly difficult for them to answer that question. As a result, very little planning, anticipation, or prevention is possible. Yes, we can probably mitigate some risks, but because risks are what affect our processes, affect our systems, affect our data, even if we believe we cannot mitigate the risks, chances are we haven't thought about everything that has to do about that risks. Now, luckily for us, and that is something that has been a realization for Erwin for a long time, but it hasn't actually permeated across the market until very recently, is that there is a connecting tissue between all of them. And these two things that I outlined here in bold, it's processes and data, but not processes or data. It's the two put together. And we'll look at 2 case studies later on, which actually show how all those two things can work together to make our operational risk management effective, instant, and actually really, really beneficial to the organization. It's one of the few times when we can say 1 + 1 equals 3. In other words, the benefit of combining governance, risk, and control with processes and data, the sum is much, much greater than the parts themselves. So I did say we keep on seeing different things in the market. Let's look at them in a little bit more detail. Why? Because these are a lot of the things that we have been advocating for a long time, but also it's wonderful, and I'm sure you guys will agree, it's wonderful when you see customers coming to you with new ideas, with new concepts. And one of the use cases that I'm going to talk about today, it actually is a brand new concept that we hadn't thought until it came our way. So let's have a look. The first thing is, let's fix the systems, right? Applications that manage operational risk are exceedingly expensive. They're usually very complex. They cost a lot of money to implement and to keep updated. But isolated systems are no longer seen as sufficient. We talk with a lot of our partners and sometimes competitors in the market, and we all tend to agree that one of the things that we keep on seeing in new requests for proposal, in new requests for information, in new demands coming from the market is that, can you guys integrate seamlessly with my operational risk management system or with my compliance system? So it becomes one of the key requirements, whether we sell our enterprise and business architecture solution or whether we sell our data intelligence solution. One of the key demands is, do you guys interact with these kind of systems? The manual processes are seen as very, very risky. We recently worked, and we're still working with a large global pharmaceutical organization. And one of the few things they said is, we can no longer rely on the reports that we're getting from our risk department. And they asked us, how can we help augment what is available from their risk department by adding the application, the data, and the infrastructure layer. So you can understand how all those gaps are slowly coming to the surface. Now, we'll see exactly why they're coming to the surface, and this is one of the fundamental reasons. It's external regulations. Now, I particularly don't like regulations. They tend to make everyone's life more difficult. They're issued by bureaucrats who sometimes don't think of the impact, financial or otherwise, to our everyday operations, but nevertheless, they are important. Now, we are, for the first time, I think, in many, many years, and I think a lot of you might probably agree, regulations that force organizations to document their risks in real time and also make it a factual discovery, and we will see that in a few minutes as well, becoming more and more prevalent. So there was a recent, about a year ago, a regulation by the Bank of England affecting all financial institutions in the UK that said all your risk-oriented reporting must include detailed information about how your processes are impacted or control those risks and mitigate the risk and apply the controls. It was the first time ever. Since then, there have been another 15 across Europe, and certainly I think there are 3 or 4 equivalent in the US, and I'm sure there are in other parts of the world as well. So these regulations increasingly demand from the organizations actual evidence, not assessments that are qualitative based on people from the risk department. So we come to what kind of dashboards most of these regulations and most of these organizations come to us asking for. They say that I would like to use processes as the central area where I connect both my risks and my controls. Now, that is a little bit counterintuitive. Why? Because controls control risk, not processes. But there is a reality behind here, that is how are controls implemented? Well, controls are implemented through, well, not all of them, but certainly some of them are implemented by processes. Therefore, that is where everything fits together. That's where everything buttons and connects together. Okay, so the number one question asked by management, and certainly we are engaged right now in Europe with 4 massive projects. We're talking about multi-million dollar project, which is all about what is the process impact of a risk. And of course, once you start adding the layers, we'll see some of them later on. Risk reporting is now all about processes. Believe it or not, one of the largest financial institutions in the world, which is our customer, and they're using our system for their global business architecture, right? All the management reporting, and I'm talking C-level reporting, is now process-based. Other risk management systems now require process input. We've been approached by 4 different customers who are already our customers, of course, to ask us how we can now connect to their risk management systems. Why? Because those systems now demand from the rest of the business to give them that kind of feedback so they can do their job effective. And final, compliance. Now, compliance, I'm going to talk a little bit more general. I'm going to spread the purview of this slide a little bit, and not talk only about operational risk, but also talk about compliance vis-a-vis, let's say, one of the ISO, one of the Sarbanes-Oxley, and so on and so forth. So put in both, optional and mandated compliance element, right? Now, they themselves, I don't know if any of you have looked at the latest version of ITIL or the latest version of MiFID. All of them actually demand dashboards to be process-based. Now, sometimes we tend to ignore them because they are in the more detailed parts, but they're actually in there in the minimum requirements. Auditors and controllers, certainly that's something that we've been seeing. Well, we've been getting this information from our customers more and more. Auditors and controllers now must document for every risk and control what are the processes that are either impacted or used in their implementation. No report is now accepted without the process layer. And of course, the multi-level dashboards are now also important. One of the hardest things we've had to do, and I'm talking literally at implementation level right now, is with one of our customers, they said, well, I have 7 layers of processes. Now, some may argue this is too much, some may argue this is too little, but it doesn't matter. 7 layers of processes. They said, I want risk reporting at every level. I also want it aggregated at every aggregate level, so from 1 to 2, from 1 to 3, and so on and so forth. But I also want to be able to drill down from the top to the bottom and constantly see the risk profile at every level in time. Now, if you think about the breadth and quantity of data that we're talking about here, we're talking about millions upon millions of points of data, and we will see that use case in a few minutes to actually bring it together. Now, the reason why I put this number out there is because for me, it's absolutely astounding. If we were having this conversation, let's say, I don't know, a year and a half back, I wouldn't be able to tell you anything like that. But now, certainly, like I said, in the last 16 to 20 months, we're seeing that 6 out of 10 customers and prospects now introduce risk, or for them, risk and process are actually integrally connected. I'm going to go even further and tell you that 3 out of 4 RFPs and RFIs that we receive, one of the fundamental sections that is there, and usually it's classified as a must, it's all about, can you connect with XYZ risk management system? Or can your system effectively manage compliance, risk and control vis-a-vis, of course, always your business or enterprise architecture? Let's face it, Erwin does not sell an operational risk management system. So this is certainly something that fundamentally changes the market. Now, the question is, I've been talking about this and I've been trying to give you hints and tips here, but one of the things that we have found that it helps when we talk to our customers who they know it because the regulations and the legal entities tell them that it is, but they can't actually see how those things fit together. So all those little things that we're talking about, governance, risk, control, business and enterprise architecture, how do they all fit together? So we created this nice little graphic, which our customers love, and I think actually drives the point in the beginning. So I'm going to put processes in the middle. And there is a reason behind this. The graphic wouldn't work otherwise, but you will see how that works. So processes, traditionally, we're talking about what? We're talking about processes, of course, the activities within the processes, the systems these processes are using, the capabilities that they deliver or they're responsible for, things like locations and organizations, the services that deliver those processes, and so on and so forth. So this is usually the ecosystem that Erwin traditionally plays really well in. Okay, now there's another layer, and we're talking about it in a minute, but this is something that we have a really, really good reputation, and we do really well in it. And let's face it, most of you, when I talk about something like that, you instantly know what I'm talking about. Whether I call it TOGAF, whether I call it Archimate, whether I call it whatever you want, everyone knows what pretty much this is about. Now, sometimes we tend to enhance that, right? Depending on what project we're running in, we can add other elements such as documents, checklists, activities, risks, controls, and compliance. In other words, the GRC environment that we talked about. Now, traditionally, and as you can see now, the arrows move vertically, so across. Those things are designed to fit together, but very rarely are they designed to fit any other layer. And that is, I think, what the current status is. And of course, here we come to what Erwin does really, really well. And for those of you who I'm sure you will follow some of the other presentations in Erwin Insights, you will find out, a lot about that as well. So of course, we then again have governance, data quality, harvesting, lineage, and all those wonderful things, which is what? It is our factual part. It is, in other words, something that is measurable, clearly identifiable, objectively identifiable, right? Our data and our data lineage is actually something real. We can count it, we can measure it, we can assess it in real time. Processes tend to be a little bit more qualitative and so on and so forth. So this is the corporate ecosystem that is affected, believe it or not, by the majority of the regulations. And this is where Erwin usually plays very, very well. The question is, how do all of these fit together? Traditionally, therefore, are largely interconnected, but the reality and the red arrows here is what? It's not something that we believe. Believe it or not, the red arrows is what different regulations, different mandates, and different compliance elements say that you now need to provide as organizations. So for example, you need to be able to say which processes are used for governance. You need to be able to say how your data entities, your data attributes are now used by your processes. Why? Because it's a real indicator, a really objective indicator of how applications use systems and how much they rely on systems and where the risks are. You need to say how processes are affected by risks, how controls manage your capabilities, or what controls are necessary to ensure your capabilities are delivered, and of course, processes that deliver actions and so on and so forth. I don't want to go through every single one of those arrows simply because that's not what is absolutely important, but I want you to think, and believe it or not, we have a similar slide that actually colors each arrow differently depending on what, whether it's compliance, whether it's risk control, whether it's government mandated, and so on and so forth. I didn't want to put it here because it makes it a little bit messy, but I want you to see that this is the world as it's shaping up to be. So you can no longer think that these are things which are interconnected. Now, I'm going to start from the top in the bullet points. I put them there as a summary of what we've been talking until now. So one of the realizations that have been coming up and up from more organizations, and we are, I'm sure everyone within Erwin will agree enthusiastically as well, is that data is not actually owned by systems. Yes, data is processed by systems, is stored in databases, but the data itself is actually owned, processed in reality, and managed by applications, by processes. And that is the one fundamental thing that has been coming up again and again. Just to give you an idea where the world is heading, one of our largest global customers came to us 3 weeks ago and said, I want to be able to scan the systems for the data, and using your AI matching capabilities, because our data intelligence suite actually does that really well, derive what my processes are based on how data flows from one area to the other and so on and so forth. Think this is like 5 or 6 steps of where we are today, but think of how organizations are already starting to look at data and how data connects to processes. The other thing is compliance control. So in other words, how we manage our operational risk is now applied to processes which produce and use data. In other words, if there is a process that has nothing to do with data, sometimes our risk, our governance, risk and control will actually bypass it completely. Why? Because it could be something supplemental, it could be something secondary, and we even have pharmaceutical organizations who don't even map those processes that don't have to do with data, whether it's operational data or whether it's personal and other data. Risk profiles are now calculated. In other words, they are not assessed qualitatively. So for example, we have 2 customers right now who are saying that my risk profile depends on which processes those risks affect and which data, the categorization, in other words, of the data those processes are using. So if a specific process is using data that are classified as very critical or impacted by GDPR for whatever, for another example, then instantly I want my risk assessment to be classified as high, and so on and so forth. Why? Because more and more demands coming up externally to say, well, I want your assessment, your risk assessment, to be factual rather than qualitative, right? And that is the red summary at the bottom, right? In other words, we now want real data lineage. What do I mean by real data lineage? Data lineage is, of course, it does have a technical term, so how data flows from one system to the other. What I'm talking about, the real data lineage, and that's why I use the quotation marks there, it's all about how data moves across processes. So if I submit an application has data in there, how that data, how that information moves across the organization. And this is a process level lineage. Maybe I should have said process level lineage, but this is becoming key to assessing and managing operational risk and, of course, risk and compliance. So how is Erwin helping companies to move forward? Processes are certainly moving center stage. So all risk profiling, as I just explained to you, becomes process dependent. Risks and controls are only viewed with respect to their processes. Believe it or not, there is an exercise going on right now across 5 or 6 of our customers that I am aware of, where they're assessing the risk themselves vis-a-vis, is this risk connected to an application or to a process? If none of the two exist, then chances are this risk is redundant and they're actually deleting it. One of the organizations that I'm talking about went from having 190,000 risks to having just 68,000 by removing redundant risks. So all those is only possible because they started connecting the 2 layers together. Risk mitigation, again, this is now only considered if there is a process or a system attached to it. I should have said system as well. But controls that didn't have any process or any enterprise architecture dimension are now considered redundant or absolutely useless. And believe it or not, this actually comes from how controllers are viewing, how auditors are viewing those controls. Compliance also now becomes a seamless living process. What do I mean by that? I mean that both technical and qualitative compliance now meet. More and more assessors for things like ISO standards and so on and so forth, they don't just ask to see the processes. They ask to see a detailed information about the processes. The processes can no longer be a document. So here's a document, here's my standard operating procedure, have a look at that. More and more assessors come to our customers and say, let me see the process detailed, let me see how you manage your compliance at process level and so on and so forth. One of the things that we're really good, and like I said in the beginning, please contact us so we can actually show you how that works, is to automatically create risk landscapes for our organizations for their processes. And because this is an automated view, imagine how powerful that is, both in terms of implementing your and monitoring your compliance, but also attesting that when the time comes to get that through your auditors and so on and so forth. Processes are now used to implement compliance. So apart from the fact that there has to be compliance on our existing process, on operational process, or on HR processes, and so on and so forth, more and more mandates, more and more directives demand organizations to document the processes they use to ensure compliance, the processes they use to manage risks, and so on and so forth. Now, this is unknown territory. Believe it or not, surprisingly, this kind of documentation has never been the purview of most organizations. Most of the time, they're focused essentially on just documenting everything else. But when you ask them, how do you perform this? How do you do this? The answer is usually very vague and not documented well enough. And that is something that becomes more and more important. I'm going to reiterate something I mentioned before, multi-level analysis. Why is that important? Because believe it or not, and I'm sure you guys probably know that better than I do, more and more, my apologies, organizations, when they start mapping their processes, when they start mapping their business and enterprise architecture, they don't automatically or from the beginning have the full maturity to understand all the levels at which they're working. A lot of the times, this kind of need is driven by a specific transformation project, is being driven by a specific compliance requirement, and so on and so forth. But we usually tend to start at a certain level, be that level 2, level 3, level 4, depends what our level of maturity is. It depends on where the existing collateral that we have for our systems and for our documentation and for our processes are. If all the collateral we have is very low level, let's say 6, 7, 8, or whatever level you want to do, that's where we're going to start. Now, imagine that eventually we'll have to start providing dashboards across other levels as well. And that is what is becoming more and more apparent. The old days when you would have a system, even a system like the Erwin Evolve, which is a really, really good one, it's no longer enough to just document what you have at the very bottom level. Organizations need to see that at division level. And division has 3 or 4 processes, or there are 6 or 7 processes that move across different divisions, in other words, across different silos within the organization, and management wants to see what the risk profile is at different slices of that particular process. So it is important to start also thinking of how do I abstract, how do I aggregate upwards, or how do I devolve downwards. Corollary to this one, sorry for sticking to this one a little bit more, but I think it's an important step to make. One of the things that customers come to us more and more, certainly in the last year, right? Certainly in the last year, is how can I document automatically? Of course, that's like the key word here. How do I automatically document or generate my customer journey, or my value-added journey, or my value stream? You choose what kind of term you want to use. Now, systems like the Erwin Evolve can actually help you do that automatically. So once you draw your processes and how the processes talk to each other, the system can actually generate your customer journey for you. Now think how this capability, with the ability to have your risks and controls managed or documented at process level, what it allows you to do pretty much for the first time in history. It allows you to look at a customer journey, what the risk profile of elements of the customer journey is, and now bring it to today, COVID-19 era, where our customer journey fundamentally changed from something that nobody could have anticipated 12 months ago. All our customer journeys, every single one of our customer journeys have changed. A lot of our value propositions have changed. Why? Because organizations were forced to change. Guess what? If you had your risks mapped at process level, right? Looking at the customer journey, looking everything from the customer journey lens, so to speak, right? Will actually allow you to see, well, guess what? If my organization changes again next year, again, as the remnants of COVID are there, or as new things are introduced, I can see how my risk profile, how my risk averse sort of management is going to be shaped. And I can actually predict that, which is going to be, again, the first time I do that. And even more so, compliance can now be factual. So for example, if a customer comes to me and says, now you guys are doing everything remotely, since most of your colleagues are working from home, how can you ensure for me, for example, that my data is not shared with their kids, for example, or things like that? It is this kind of thing that allows us to then say, well, guess what, sir? The process is being used that way. The process has these kind of risks. This has this kind of controls, and this is how we protect you in different layers, and so on and so forth. Now, I added the last one, the data to compliance question. Why? Because fundamentally, everything we do is all about information. Now, I know I call it data here is because that's something that, Erwin, we are the data governance company. So the reason why I put it there is because everything we do, even risks and controls, they're all about data. They're all about information. They're all about how do we manage them and assess them in real time. Without this, it's kind of impossible to do anything factually. We can always say, I think that risk is high, but this is no longer enough. And last but not least, I should have put it in twice the size that it currently is. It's all about impact analysis. Believe it or not, as I'm involved in a lot of implementations for our customers, half of the things that we build for customers these days, that we configure for customers these days, half of the dashboards we certainly build for them are all about potential impact analysis. So if I am to change that process, can you show me what the impact will be on my risk profile? If I am to remove that risk, can you please tell me which processes I will need to revisit to make sure that they don't need adjustment? Believe it or not, that is the first thing they go to. That is the thing where they spend probably more than 70% of their time. Everything else is necessary input into those kinds of views and this kind of dashboards. But the fundamental thing is that impact analysis is where the actual first interest is. So please do keep that in mind, because it's absolutely important. Looking at, of course, managing operational risk and the outside when an auditor comes in, or whether we're called to present evidence to for an external regulator and so on and so forth. It's all about making it objective and actually quantifiable. In other words, data right now become the prime candidate in actually helping us to manage our operational risk, but not isolated, always driving or working through how our process is connecting those two together. So let's look at the changes a little bit in more sort of direct way. I've covered most of that, during the last few minutes when we're talking about this, but let's look at it in a little bit diagrammatic way, and hopefully we can enhance our understanding of this. So fundamental note here, I actually put it there so I don't forget. What you're going to see here today in this slide is not something theoretical that Erwin created. This is taken from how our customers are now managing the GRC. So first of all, we all are aware that there is a GRC layer. It exists whether we are fully aware of it or not, but we know it's there. It comprises of mandatory components, things we can't get away from, things like risks, controls. Traditionally, these are manually entered, manually documented. Now, there are some areas, certainly the financial sector in the United States, certainly some countries within Europe, where governments actually issue those mandates, those risks, and the controls, the minimum ones anyway. They issue them in a file format that organizations can download and pretty much automatically embed. But let's face it, each organization is more aware of what their internal risks and controls can be or should be. So this is the mandatory part. And of course, we've got the optional part, things like standards, actions we need to do, compliance elements we need to follow, and so on and so forth. Luckily for us, these are fully documented. So if you decide tomorrow that you want to be 27,000 compliant, instantly you can go to the necessary site, download the entire standard with all the assessments, with all the descriptions, with all the mandates, all the questions, all the documents that we need to provide. These are all available to download and leverage. So this is our GRC layer. Now, remember the first problem I told you right back in the first slide, that traditionally all of that are managed like that. Like I have an Excel file with the risks, I have an Excel file with the compliance elements, or I've bought a system that I can actually upload some of those things, but it doesn't talk to anything else. So this is how traditionally that has been managed. We've got the data layer. Now the data layer is there. Why? Because we all use applications, right? Right now we're using, I'm using the webinar application to deliver this talk to you. There is data that are being transferred by the system, and so on and so forth. Now we're talking about data quality. That can be partly automated. Of course, we're, the industry and Erwin is making huge advances in that area of how we can actually gauge automatically and validate our data quality. We're talking about metadata scanning, which Erwin does fully automatically. So you can point Erwin to any system, and it will actually bring in fully detailed with all this information, all the metadata in the system and in a database, and of course allow you to draw how your data lineage is done, which is again something that is fully automated. Now, so we can say with relatively certainty that the data layer is something that is fully automated, or at least is very factual, as opposed to the GRC layer, which, as you can see, all of it is manual. Now, let's add the process layer in the middle. Why? Because that is where all those two meet. How do they meet? The metadata structures are being fed into the process layer. So for the first time, somebody will say process step X or process Y, which data is it using? Now, why do we say that? Traditionally, ask yourself that question. If we were live in an audience right now, I would ask you and I would expect an answer from that one. But let me do that theoretically here. If someone asks you which applications is the system using, you would probably say, I'm using Word, I'm using Excel, and so on and so forth. Chances are you could have forgotten something, or chances are that this may actually change. However, the question that more and more organizations are asking these days is not which system are you using, is can you tell me what information, what data, in other words, you are processing in this process step. So what do I say? Name, surname, address, attachment, whatever. I describe what it is that I'm doing in terms of the information that I'm manipulating or accessing in a specific process. Now, because of the metadata scanning that we're talking about at the bottom layer, the gray layer, automatically the system can tell me which systems I'm using. And that is what is absolutely fundamental these days. We don't rely on a qualitative assessment or a person's memory, because processes tend to be very factual. In a process, it'll say complete the necessary information. And the necessary information you want to capture is A, B, C, D, and E. Once I know what that is, I can probably guess, or I can actually trace the lineage of how this fits together with my entire ecosystem. Now, once I actually capture that, I can start abstracting, and I'm looking now from left to right. From the process, I can look at how these data is being managed by my capabilities. In other words, if I do have a data breach, and that could be a risk, right? How do I mitigate it? What impact will it have on my organization? And what are the necessary controls to manage this? Looking at them from right to left, I can identify the systems, and I can identify the interfaces between systems. Why? If you look at the news, certainly the last couple of years, you will see that most data breaches happen either at database level or at interface level. Interfaces is how applications talk to each other. So one of the things that we're seeing an immense expansion of is how risks and controls and operational risks are actually now targeting how systems through processes or processes themselves talk to each other. Because fundamentally, most of the weakness is identified there, statistically speaking. And of course, we've got governance management, who now becomes, by the sheer volume of automation that we're pushing from the bottom up, is now becoming more and more fully automated. I shouldn't have said fully automated, I should have said increasingly automated. Why? Because right now, as my risks and controls now match my processes, as I said a little bit earlier, if you remember in the previous slide, instantly I can tag my risk or my control through the data that I have or through the process. I can tag it as sensitive or not sensitive, as compliant or not compliant, and so on and so forth. So we're moving in a world where everything was done manually, where everything was disconnected, to a fully integrated world. Now, you may probably be thinking, and I'm sure you are, because I probably was thinking that about 16, 20 months ago, is, yeah, that's a fantastic story, but we're probably quite a ways away from that. Believe it or not, we're not. Apart from the two use cases that we're going to see in a minute, as I said in the beginning, more and more customers are asking us to solve this particular conundrum. Actually provide them with this capability that you see here. Now, some of them are more mature. Some of them have a better understanding of their processes. Some of them are even have a really good idea, a really good concept of how compliance and processes fit together. But actually connecting all those three together is something that has always been just outside the purview of most of the projects and is now coming central. I'm going to say that more than 20% or 30% of services revenue for Erwin, certainly in the enterprise and business architecture component, last year came from these kind of projects. Just to give you an idea where our customers' heads and where they're planning and where the requirements are coming in. So automated data harvesting becomes critical. Data architects are now asked, sometimes mandated, to interact with process architects and analysts. A year and a half ago, when I would deliver a demonstration or would do a proof of concept with a business or enterprise architecture, it would always be business analysts and business stakeholders. I have yet to attend a meeting certainly in the last 16 months, virtual or otherwise, where it didn't have people from enterprise and data architecture in there. It's amazing. It's fantastic. We actually love it because it actually brings us in our area of strength. But nevertheless, it's wonderful to see. And I think this is something that you should also start considering yourself. Data structures become fundamental to process modeling. I think I mentioned one of our largest customers came to us and said we expect you in your next iteration of your system to be able to derive how processes talk to each other based on the data that they manipulate. Process modeling now must include data. Now, believe it or not, Erwin always felt that. Very few customers actually use that. It's wonderful to actually see this catching on and like a wildfire. My apologies to my California and West Coast friends in the moment. And of course, data governance, risk and control, data, managing operational risk through data or managing data operational risk starts relying on processes, both on how it is implemented and what the impact is. And of course, attestation, trust me, it's the last time I'm going to mention that, now relies extensively on process to data and process to compliance relationships. So this is the, I'm not going to call it the theory, but this is the, our experience. This is what we've seen. This is how we've captured. This is what we've understood from our everything that we've been doing. Let's have a look right now. Oops, I forgot that. And the impact analysis. I can't believe I forgot that. I told you before it's the most important thing. But let's now look at a couple of examples. Now, fundamentally, and I'm sure you guys understand that very clearly, that I can't actually share their names because we're talking about operational risk, but I can actually give you a lot of details. So, large global financial institution, okay? We're talking about right now, over 10,000 processes mapped and counting in the erwin system. Now that covers global processes from different countries, different areas of the organization, comparative and non-comparative, inclusive and non-inclusive, spread across 9 different levels in different languages. The idea is that by the end of 2021, there's going to be 50,000 processes. Guess what? Why are they putting all this effort in there? Because literally, regulations across 7 different countries right now mandate it. They say you cannot do this unless you have that clearly documented. Over 250,000 instances of risks, controls, control libraries, and their relationships. Every week, it is integrated from the risk management system directly to our enterprise and business architecture system. Why? Because none of these processes now, and as you will see right now, risks and controls associated as a mandatory exercise with a steps or with a process step or a process itself. Think about it. No process is considered complete unless the risks and controls that affect it or are implemented through it are actually mapped. And that is now one of the key mandates across the entire organization. Direct and indirect dashboards available at C-level executives. Think about it. When we sold our system to this particular customer, it was something that would address projects within the organization. Within a year and a half, we now have demand for visibility at C-level executives. There are 9 of them, I think. C-level executives now demand dashboards at process level, at organizational level, at location level, all of them risk profiles, sorry, my apologies, I should have said risk profiles driven by processes. Think about it. The amount of data that we're moving right here, it's millions of data points and all that. So a manager who's on his first class seat, getting ready to go from one area, from one country to another, or from one continent to another, even today, can log in and say, I'm traveling to Japan right now. What is the country risk profile this week? How is that country managing risk this week, and what do I need to address while I'm there? It's actually pretty daunting and pretty horrifying. And of course, interactive views become absolutely critical. Why do I mention this interactive use? Why? Because the old ways of giving someone a PDF or a PowerPoint with a pie chart or a red, amber, green traffic light are dead. I can tell you that they are dead. If one thing you can take away from today is that a PowerPoint showing a risk profile or showing how we manage risk is dead. What management right now wants is, okay, it is red. I want to click on it and I want to be able to instantly find out why is it red and where is it red. Oh, is it because that particular process or that particular process area is red? Why is that area red? Because these 6 risks, these 6 controls are marked as ineffective and so on and so forth. They want to know the why and the where. An average or a high-level dashboard actually means nothing to them these days. And any action now, any action is basically coordinated based on the process impact. So literally 2 weeks ago, we're asked, can you guys prove to us that if we are to change these 4,000 risks, can you tell us what the process impact would be? Believe it or not, it was something we had already built for them. So we said, actually, if you click that one, you will actually see it immediately. The relief on the call to see that they can actually get that information instantly was literally palpable. You could actually hear the tension draining away during the call. So think about what kind of capability that is. So enough with these guys. Really big enough, but they don't do everything we're talking about today. Let's talk about a large telecoms organization, multi-country as well. Here we're moving a little bit away from processes, but processes remain very key. Their entire enterprise architecture ecosystem was focused against optimization and transformation. I'm not going to give you the details, but it was all about application rationalization, new systems integration, and so on and so forth. Key to that was a process layer. Why? Because if you are to move from, from 3,000 applications, right? You want to move to, let's say, 150 or 200 or 300 applications, right? The processes are going to change by definition. And if you want, on top of this rationalization, introduce 4 or 5 key ERP modules, be that SAP or any other one, instantly your process fundamentally will change. So that was absolutely critical level. And of course, how do we know how to rationalize effectively? Unless we know if the 2,000 applications we're going to chuck, what data are they manipulating? Now that data, you can't only rely on the applications, because what if I have an application that actually moves critical data for a process, but I look at it and I say, well, I only have 2 licenses to it and I'm going to chuck it anyway. If it's moving critical data and I can only assess that if I know the process impact, right? If I make a decision to chuck it, all of a sudden I may find out that there are processes that are no longer operational. And to do that, this is something I need to document. And the good news is that it's really easy to document. Risks are managed here at data level. So here we manage the risks are applied at the data level, and they're aggregated both at the process and the IT layers. So this is a completely different approach. This is still operational in risk, right? But because it's a telecom, for them, data risk and so on and so forth is, at least vis-a-vis this particular project, this particular initiative is key. So they're actually applying operational risk management at data layer. And of course, all those risk profiles, all those things drive the transformation decisions. Okay, so if there is an application that is carrying very sensitive data and I'm scheduled to migrate it to somewhere else, then I need to make sure that the destination system meets the same criteria, or at least adds additional mitigating controls to manage my risk the way I want it to. So I keep on referring to how Erwin has helped all these organizations. Of course, you probably have heard of the Edge platform, the enterprise data governance experience from Erwin. It's one of the few solutions, if not the only solution in the market. I'd like to believe it's the only one. I'm still to be challenged on that one. How we can actually bring all those layers together in one comprehensive ecosystem. Imagine you dive into the Erwin Edge ecosystem, and you can see your process impact. You can scan your applications and get an automated risk assessment. You can actually integrate with any of your enterprise GRC systems out there and combine all those things together. And if the GRC system wants some feedback from our system, we can even do that too. But you have a starting point where it can give you dashboards. It can give you all those wonderful things. Okay, so I'm jumping ahead of myself and I keep on forgetting. And of course, all the automation is there to help you. If we're having this conversation a couple of years ago, you would say, yeah, I want to do this, right? Let's say you were one of the pioneers and you wanted to do this. And we said, okay, how long is it going to take? I would say it's probably going to take you 12 to 14 months. These days, with Erwin's automatic harvesting AI capabilities of actually pulling the data together and the integration with our enterprise and business architecture platform, can probably do that in less than 6 months. And that is one of the reasons some of the biggest financial institutions in the world, because they are the ones that are being hammered by regulations, have chosen to use Erwin, because we can actually deliver results very, very quickly. Now, we do rely on customers as well, of course, but it is important that we can actually do that. So that brings me to the end of the presentation part. So Kathy, I don't know if we have any questions from our audience. Hopefully
Yeah,
there is
sure.
enough time to answer them.
We have about time for one. We're
Oh,
really
okay.
butting up against the hour. So if you wouldn't mind also go to advance to your last slide so we can make sure to give a
Absolutely.
promotion of what's coming up. Yes, and thank you, Marios. I mean, I loved your graphic with all the arrows to show how isolated systems are no longer sufficient, but process-based inputs are indeed critical and increasingly mandated. To that point, what is the length and complexity of a typical GRC project using Erwin Edge?
Exactly. If you remember, I just mentioned some ideas about this. So if you are to only look at the process layer and the GRC layer, it can be as little as 4 to 6 to 7 months. Now, if you add the data layer and you leverage our automatic scanning capability, then I would add the variable, which is what is your level of maturity. If you have 300, 400 systems, within 6 to 7 months, probably 8, we can get you to a point where you can have really meaningful objective dashboards going through the entire system. If you have 2,000 applications that we need to scan and do this, then the chances are that's going to take a little bit longer, simply because everything goes together. But I would say on average, depending on obviously on the size of the organization, anything between 4 and 8 to 12 months would be the maximum, I would say, before you are in a really practical production situation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Marios. I
You're
know you'll
welcome.
be willing to follow up with questions we received through the Q&A chat after
Absolutely,
the
of
event,
course.
so you'll get in touch with them direct. So
Of
up
course.
next, we have a customer roundtable on business process modeling that I know is, I've been looking forward to that, and I hope everyone will enjoy that.
Absolutely.
Be sure to check out the sessions in the other 2 tracks as well. We have our DI track and our data modeling track as well. And everything is available on demand. So if you missed anything at the start of the session hour, it's most likely already moved into on-demand format. And also be sure to head over to our networking lounge. Our solution booths are still open to network and ask experts some questions and see our latest customer reviews showcased at the IT Central Station booth. And if you're willing and a current customer, we'd love for you to sign up and give your own product review as well. So at this time, Marios, one last thank you so much for all of your expertise and guidance that you've provided.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And this concludes this session.